Howdy, all you delicious people! Row, row. As I'm wearing a tiger shirt today, I don't know why. Justifiably, I just wear weird and odd shirts because I can. So today we are here to talk about American Gods, season two, episode 5 and 6. It's kind of weird, almost feeling that fairly soon I'm going to get caught up with the show to the more current portion of this. And so, reasonably, I'm just kind of baffled because I didn't think that I would stick with this show ultimately to review it for that length of time. Not that there's anything bad with the show. I just ultimately just don't tend to stick with shows very often. I just kind of like do a little bit here, do a little bit there, and then ultimately I might come back to it and review a little bit more. But ultimately, I just don't have that kind of time to really 100% tie myself onto a show all the time. Uh, so luckily, this is one of those where hopefully I can just keep on with the show at some point. So season two, episode 5 and 6 were kind of like I felt like episode 5 was just kind of I'm kind of just like okay, there's something interesting about it, but like I don't quite see the value of the episode. I don't see like what is the kind of what is the real like importance of this episode? Like, does it end up tying into the war? No, it just kind of ties upon like, hey, let's have a ghost story kind of thing. And ultimately, there is like a point in this episode where I'm just like, ooh, gee golly, I'm like that is some harsh things going on there that I'm seeing with one character, of course. So And oh, gee golly, what kind of stupid words are that? That seemed kind of dumb to say. Um, but anyways, we ultimately went into this show, and I thought the episode after that was fairly interesting. I thought reasonably like how I was thinking the entire time. I'm like, okay, so this has something to do with Norse gods. So, okay, like, are we gonna, like, what kind of stories are we eventually going to tell? And I think episode 6 kind of dips into that and really just goes, okay, this is a much more interesting story for for tying in the whole Norse gods thing. If you know what I'm talking about, if you have no clue, then ultimately I'll tell you within spoilers. Uh, I thought that recently, I guess we find out a setting of the show. Ultimately, we find out via one of the episodes that this show is taking place in 1989. So we haven't even gotten into the 2000s yet. So, like, recently, this whole war is going on in our past, which I thought was interesting because when looking at it, there is a an image in the background that ultimately says 1989. So I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So going into these episodes, it kind of reminded me uh, of some kind of uh, big budget movies, and I will reminisce and probably talk about that in the spoiler variations. But yeah, it seems like there is two, or well, technically a franchise is the other. Well, both of them are franchises, but like it kind of ties into some familiar territory that I will talk about um, in the spoilers. Because ultimately, I'm sorry, there's not much that I could say in this one to ultimately just talk about all of this stuff. But anyways, I thought that this episode was interesting, or I thought that these episodes were interesting, and I really want I really would like for there to be more episodes that are more like these episodes that are here, rather than the stuff that they have been doing. If they're gonna make it to where it is a flashback piece or it is a like, because ultimately this was a flashback piece, and normally I would groan these 2 episodes. Normally I would groan about a flashback piece, but I was perfectly okay with these flashback pieces. Ultimately, I was really fascinated and intrigued by both these episodes. And ultimately, I think every single flashback episode should be done just like this. If ultimately to help us really justify inserting a character. Like I think uh, we had Bilquist and we had Essie McGowan as like flashback episodes, but reasonably that didn't help us really get to know Bilquist because ultimately it didn't tie anything to her like going forward. Essie McGowan didn't tie into Laura Moon's story or whatever, or the Leprechaun story going forward. And to me, honestly, it just made it seem like the Leprechaun had a longer, longevous life than we were led to believe. But there wasn't anything much that ultimately tied those people to those past stories that ultimately helped us in more current time, where ultimately when going into these flashbacks and these episodes, uh, I feel like these flashbacks ultimately helped us with the story. It helped us understand where things were going, and I could appreciate those things for being the way that they are. So, by and large, let's go into spoilers about these episodes. There's probably a lot that I need to probably talk about, probably. So, we're going to get into those and ultimately just talk about these episodes because I thought that they were, for the most part, just kind of fun. When ultimately kind of seeing there be like kind of like a like I would call like episode uh like I would probably have to call episode 6 ultimately feeling to me like Captain America. How when Captain America would eventually go and he was kind of forced into being the dancing monkey and otherwise just kind of performing all over the world and hitting Hitler 2,000 times or something like that. Like that kind of really relays to what's going on in episode 6, I believe. So let's go into this. Let's ultimately bust out that double five to otherwise spoil the show. Ultimately, I'm probably not going to go into heavily detail because at the end of the day, this is going out of our way to talk about 2 episodes, and I'm going to try to just kind of rush through maybe some of it. So reasonably, we have it to where let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil. Coaching this show. Instead of a gun, I got a sword going on to ka-ching today. Anyways, so in this first episode, we have it be very much a ghost story, I believe, realistically. We have it to seemingly be where there is a ghost that is seemingly haunting Shadow Moon. Just kind of really we have it to where this ghost seemingly is really scaring the bejeebus out of Shadow Moon, and to where ultimately we have it to where they have to tell us the backstory of this ghost, and it seems that this ghost kind of echoes through other people. Where ultimately every single time a person ends up getting arrested, there seems to be I would call it like a pike of sorts and or like a stick of sorts, and you have this head on top of it, and their head is on fire, and I'm like, what is the whole like man, that is kind of crazy. Like I remember like Vlad the Impaler used to like actually just like kind of like he used to take people's bodies and actually just like skewer them like shish kebabs, which is awful to mention, but that's what happened in history. So, and ultimately, I just don't quite understand when like people are talking about like Dracula and whatever, and like a lot of times like they don't realize that there is a kind of Vlad the Impaler story where it's kind of just awful, where it's like, what do you think Vlad the Impaler means? What do you think it means? There's some horrible uh, talking about that. Like I thought it was bizarre that ultimately I was watching some interview where ultimately there was some girl, let's just say, that was not even like knowing about Vlad the Impaler's backstory, and then she finally heard about it, and she's like, "Oh my god, I can't believe I'm here! I can't believe that I'm." Yeah, that's what happens when you don't know the lore of somebody like Vlad the Impaler. Watch Dracula Untold or something like that. You'll get kind of a little bit more backstory than you would anywhere else because that seems to be quasi, um, like seemingly almost close to the true story than anything else. But anyways, even though it kind of has that vampire thing, you know what I mean. So going into this episode, we have it to where there is a man that ultimately gets horrifically uh, tortured and or killed, and this man ultimately seems to be a man who is, of course, of a African American descent, and ultimately we see this man ultimately seemingly get like shot, hung, and like dragged off via this chariot, and I'm like, oh my god, this is awful. This is awful. This is the worst thing to see. And so ultimately we have it to where this spirit ultimately is haunting uh seemingly uh seemingly the people of this place. And we eventually have it to where Shadow Moon is eventually seeing this person, and ultimately, while seeing this person, um, like man, Shadow Moon would probably never want to live right where like Ibris is with his like doing his whole mortician and whatever. What happened to Anubis? What happened to the God of Death? Is he like off on travels to get people? He must be really busy, I guess, because I haven't seen him in I don't know how long. So maybe he left. Maybe he left the show. Anyways, so because ultimately, I guess Ibris is just now like taking over for the God of Death's duties. Yes, I said duty. Ha 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 ha. Anyways, so they ultimately have it to where in this first episode they are trying to figure out this. They're trying to figure out this ghost thing going on, but also we have it to where Odin is also going and trying to find someone to fix his spear, and ultimately he at first goes to a dwarf to ultimately try to sway him to ultimately fix his spear. And it seems like this character is Gungnir or Gornir, ultimately kind of reminding me of Lord of the Rings, ultimately talking about dwarves and stuff like that. And so ultimately this kind of approach to this kind of reminds me of the Thor movies, and we'll kind of get to that into the next episode. Um, but yeah, we have it to where seemingly Odin needs to get his spear fixed, but he's going to the wrong guy. Like he ends up going to one guy, and one guy directs him into finding another dwarf that is in some mall somewhere. So we have it to where ultimately we have to where Shadow Moon is going to confront this ghost. And also while this is all going on, we also have Laura, who's going to New Orleans, and she is going and greeting the leprechaun, who ultimately is drunk off his ass. He is drunk. God, is he drunk? God, is he just so effing drunk? And why wouldn't he be? So ultimately, we have it to where it seems that Laura is to meet two New Orleans like witch doctors. Ultimately, one of them I know from Luke Cage season 2. He was the villain of that show. I'm trying to figure out where he is, and because ultimately I know him fairly well. Uh, Baron, yeah, Baron. That's what I was like. God, like I know. I think his name is Baron or Beryl or something. Like Baron Samedi. Samedi. It's probably pronounced wrong. Um, so ultimately, they end up going on their way to this Baron, and we have it to where Laura is ultimately getting smoke blowed in her face, and it seems like they are doing some kind of voodoo-ish like magic to work on this girl, and it seems that bizarrely we have it to where the leprechaun falls for the Baron's woman, and it seems that Laura ends up with the Baron, and they of course just sleep together, if you know what I mean. And we have it to where because recently when looking at it, whenever this couple from the Baron, like whenever Baron and Baron's wife parts, I guess they ultimately just end up just sleeping with whoever, and so reasonably it just ends up being that these two people end up just sleeping with the leprechaun and Laura. We find out that seemingly that the leprechaun has something for Laura, hence why he's helping her bizarrely. And ultimately the Baron's wife is ultimately like sniffing it out because it seems that the leprechaun was very hesitant about wanting to sleep with this girl, and it's like, oh, you must just find something intriguing about this dead girl, huh? And so reasonably they sleep it off, and it seems that Laura's coin has recharged, but it seems like she's still ralphing up maggots, which is gross. But ultimately it seems that we have gotten closer to possibly have Laura seemingly feel alive, even at to one point where she eats something and she's like, oh, I can actually taste that. So it seems that Laura is becoming close to feeling like a living person, but ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't believe. So ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon eventually has to confront this spirit, and this spirit is burning, and ultimately we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is ultimately going to some funeral of sorts, and we have it to where the priest uh is ultimately talking his sermon, and ultimately wanting to go with the girl that is at this funeral place, uh, because he is ultimately just kind of wanting to kind of move on, and ultimately wherever this girl is, he wants to follow her. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Bilquis is wanting to take this girl along with her, but that's not going to work either. But anyways, we have Shadow Moon eventually going into this funeral. Eventually, he has an interesting speech, and ultimately, everybody was just kind of like, like yeah, they were really like amen and all kinds of stuff, and So reasonably, I guess that speech got Shadow Moon to the point of really confronting the spirit and really making amends for all the issues of whatever of his past and so on and so forth. So recently, that was the big part of this episode was confronting the spirit of sorts, but also kind of getting Laura and the Leprechaun to New Orleans, and also finding out where to go next for this spear. So the very next episode is really having them uh, do a number of things. It's to get this spear to work and also have Odin's backstory a little bit more clear. Um, and I just kind of thought, I was like, okay, this episode starts out so freaking weird. I'm like, where are they going with this? I'm like, what it like this seems so random. And then eventually they make sense out of this randomness. I'm like, oh, so there's actually a story behind this. I'm like man, like Odin just had a weird dream in this episode, but ultimately that dream means more of what's going on in this story. So I really skipped over a lot of that other episode, and so realistically, I apologize. But when looking at it, uh, that episode was interesting, but it was a lot of like it felt also uh, like filler as well. To be brutally honest, but there was some interesting talk going on in that episode, but really there was not much going on. So pushing on into this next episode, which I thought was way more intriguing, and I thought was like okay, like they ultimately had like the whole burlesque thing, which I was like, yeah, like that was great. That was interesting. So, but ultimately, that's not all. That was the best part of that episode. So we have it to where uh, Odin has to ultimately collect or ultimately get Shadow Moon to go with him to go onto this mall. So we have it to where seemingly the dwarves had to give up their place uh, because it had turned into a mall. So we have it to where eventually these dwarves are working at this mall, and so ultimately we have it to where Mr. Wednesday has to go and get this spear fixed. But also there is also a backstory going on where Shadow Moon ultimately asks Mr. Wednesday, it's like, well, hey, like if you're Odin, right? Whatever happened to like your son Thor or Loki or whatever? What happened to any of those people? And so in this episode, we have to talk about that because ultimately Odin is having dreams about his time in this burlesque show, where ultimately he had the showing of a guy named uh, Dorar or Dorar. I Dora. God, I'm trying to pronounce his name correctly. Uh, I might have to pause here for a second to get his name. Let's pause here. Donar. I'm like, okay. I'm like, I know. So we have this character named Donar that ultimately seems to be very strong. Absurdly strong, ultimately has some kind of axe of sorts, or some kind of hammer of sorts. So we ultimately have it to our Donar. Quasi looks fairly familiar, and I don't quite understand why. So the Donar, we ultimately have Donar, who is reasonably a character that ultimately is mixed in with this girl named Columbia, and it seems that Donar and Columbia are the big showrunners of this burlesque show that is done seemingly in the 1930s 1930s, the 1950s, somewhere in there. Um, Somewhere in like the 19 between the 1930s and 40s, I think. Probably 1939 or so. I don't know why that's coming to me. I don't know why. But anyways, so we have Odin, who ultimately is running a burlesque show, and ultimately his key stars are Columbia and Donar. So ultimately, we have Donar, who is absurdly strong, and Columbia is just absurdly talented. Ultimately, it seems like Columbia is kind of a very like cowgirl, Ash-like person, and Donar is kind of a much more barbarian Ash looking character. He's much more of a Viking Ash looking character. Maybe kind of resembles like maybe quite possible maybe a Thor Ash like character, I guess, if that's your kind of thing. Uh I guess maybe. So we ultimately have it to where Donar and Columbia are they're showcasing their abilities. We have it to where Donar is just absurdly strong. To where the point is he's like doing this trick where he's like holding women up like with absurdity, and we have it to where ultimately Columbia her talent is ultimately to sing, and then ultimately just to eventually just start taking her clothes off of sorts, of course. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably we have in this flashback that it seems like Technical Boy is there in flashback. We ultimately have it to where ultimately the invention of the time is the telephone. To where ultimately we have it uh, to where Odin is ultimately mentioning to Technical Boy that hey, why aren't you on our side? Ultimately, with the ancient ones, um, ultimately we're the ones that ended up helping you be able to get this thing called a telephone, and ultimately kind of using the telephone as the first invention of Technical Boy. Um, how he basically made electricity or made a phone and stuff like that. So we have it to where ultimately that so they keep doing these shows, and Technical Boy keeps popping up. To where ultimately it seems like they are starting to realize that hey, like Donner and Columbia are kind of getting getting to where people are interested in them. We ultimately have a guy that is wearing a swastika on his arm, ultimately coming to Donner, ultimately asking to have him uh, join some weight competition. I think it's probably for the Olympics. So we ultimately have Donner, who is just like, well, sure, I don't know who these people are. Ultimately, I'll join uh, the this Olympic sport, and ultimately I'll win the whole thing because of course I can. I'm stronger than any living person that has ever lived, and so I should be able to beat anyone. We ultimately have it to where this guy ultimately goes into this Olympic competition and starts just cleaning everybody's clock. And ultimately, we find out that this guy with this interesting, or not interesting, this horrific swastika upon his arm is ultimately telling this champion to eventually throw the last fight to let the German guy win. Uh, and so reasonably we have Donner who is like, no, I'm not going to throw this competition. I'm not going to lose for this German guy. Like, I know that I can win. And ultimately, Donner is ultimately wanting everybody to worship him, and he thinks that if he wins everything, that ultimately he will be worshipped. And ultimately, if he doesn't win this, that ultimately he will be forgotten about. So we have it to where eventually, since Donner doesn't want to throw this competition, he eventually just wants to run off with Columbia and be uh, like just kind of run off and just kind of do whatever they want. We have it to where ultimately Odin is ultimately wanting to keep both Columbia and Donar separate, and or I want to say Donar or Donar. I guess it doesn't really matter. Um, but I'm just gonna keep saying Donar. So even though I probably should say Donar because I think that's probably the more northern way of talking because there's reasons. Um, so Donar, let's say Donar because I would probably say that more pronouncing it probably. If I was looking at a piece of paper, I would say Donar. So even though it sounds like you're saying donut, anyways, Donar ultimately to is to run off, and we have it to where Mr. Wednesday is grabbing up Technical Boy and wanting Columbia to go with Technical Boy, and I'm just like, okay, well, it seems that ultimately we found out that Columbia had gotten snubbed by uh, the French god of liberty, or Libertius, Libertius, however that's pronounced. Um, ultimately Columbia was just kind of forced to be relegated to where she was because ultimately there was always some other female gal that ultimately just kind of got in her way, and so ultimately that's where she was just left to be here. But it seems like Technical Boy is interested in Columbia to ultimately just kind of go and get back into the trenches, get back into doing something good. So because Columbia and Donar was going to run off, and but reasonably Columbia is just kind of like going, well, I think I could be like used a little bit better. I think there's much more potential in what Technical Boy is offering. So we have it to where eventually Odin ultimately goes out of his way to find Donar, and ultimately we have it to where Donar is ultimately going to leave, and Odin's like, no. Like, if anything, you're going to throw the thing, like the people said, to the German, and you're just going to move on. People are still going to root for you. People are still going to worship you. And that's here when ultimately we have this real, true fight out between ultimately Donar and Odin. So we have it to where Odin gets out his spear. We have Donar who gets out his hammer. Because ultimately we have to now say that Donar was actually Thor this entire time. And so reasonably this battle between the two ultimately led for Thor to break Odin's spear and walk off. Ultimately, with Odin yelling, it's like, God, like, look at the power that you have. Like, look at the strength and power that you have. Like, are you seriously going to give that all up? Are you seriously going to just walk away from all that power that you have? And Odin just walks off. Or, Thor just walks off. And to be um, said later that ultimately Odin says, like, yeah, like, Thor ended up just taking his life. He ended up just shooting himself and dying for that. What a wasted life. Ba 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 ba. So we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is hearing this story that Odin is telling about his son, because really, like, what had happened is that they went to this mall and ultimately uh, had talked to this dwarf, and this dwarf said, "Well, we will help you fix or repair this staff, but you have to give us something very powerful in return." So ultimately, we had it to where Odin has to go and get this high valued item of some jacket of some rock star, and that is ultimately in this mall, and ultimately it's like $7,500. So we have it to where Odin's like, good God, like this jacket that they want is like ridiculously expensive, and there's no rational sense to like get this jacket. Like they're like, if anything, like seriously, they couldn't have given me an easier task to do or whatever. So we have a tour. Eventually, Odin is ultimately going to go into this store as a priest and ultimately go and try to buy this jacket. And so he ends up buying the jacket, ultimately lying out of his mouth. And we have to eventually Shadow Moon and the security guards go and come after this priest. And so ultimately we have it to where uh, Shadow Moon is mentioning to this store clerk, it's like, hey, like, if anything, these bills that ultimately Mr. Wednesday had is fake. This priest had was fake. Go and check them. And so ultimately, uh, they found out that they are supposedly fake bills, and so reasonably, uh, we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is just saying, "Hey, yeah, like we're gonna have to collect all this money for evidence, and we're gonna have to collect this jacket for evidence," and ultimately we have it to where Shadow Moon at the tail end of all this, when he's putting on his sunglasses, like you did a great service to America. This store clerk is ultimately like doing a great service for America by catching this thief, and so we have it to where ultimately Shadow Moon and the priest ultimately go on to uh, like getting out of their disguises and hiding in a portion of this mall till it closes. And so ultimately they give this dwarf this jacket that ultimately gives him more power, and he's like, and he's ultimately going and fixing the staff, which I guess uh, I don't know if you can exactly say that they exactly fixed it. It doesn't look like it's like 100% fixed to me, but I guess that just kind of resolves that it'll eventually get fixed at some point, 100% to the point where it's perfectly fine in whichever one would have you. But anyways, yeah, I thought that the flashbacks, and because ultimately it helps us find out like how this staff got damaged, and I thought that it was a very intriguing flashback, even though there was some kind of parts of it where I was kind of like, oh, that kind of sucks that like they finally actually do get to Thor, but they basically just say that Thor just ended up just offing himself, and like that kind of sucks. Like, wouldn't it be more interesting if ultimately like Donar is just kind of waiting in the wings somewhere, and ultimately to have Odin just made up that story, because it's like, do you think I would let my son end up that way? Do you really but who knows? Maybe because eventually I would have liked to have assessed that ultimately that was a lie that Shadow Moon told him, to ultimately conceal Donar's safety. I would have assessed. But anyways, because I thought it was interesting that within this episode we had it to where ultimately uh, when Mr. Wednesday was talking to Shadow Moon, like it was just kind of interesting how like Odin was mentioning that Shadow Moon reminded him of his son, and hence why starting this whole story off. I thought that that was really intriguing to ultimately go like, okay, so Shadow Moon is kind of the quite possible equivalent to Thor. And even within these episodes, we had like Mr. Nancy ultimately mentioning um, about like someone like someone peeing on everyone, and ultimately, like I thought that that joke was kind of funny. To ultimately, uh, like Mr. Nancy was mentioning, like yeah, like this guy's peeing on us, or like I think I don't know, I don't remember exactly what the joke was, but he said like if anything the like people are peeing on us, and ultimately at the end of the day like the sky is filled with pee and whatever, and ultimately uh that ultimately when while the sky is falling of pee, we'll have to ultimately Mr. Nancy says that Mr. Wednesday will tell Shadow Moon that it's raining, um or to think that it's raining. I thought that that joke was kind of funny. um because ultimately we had that earlier episode where ultimately Shadow Moon was making it snow, and now it kind of like reminds us of that episode to have Mr. Nancy like mention to like, hey, if the sky's peeing on us, then then ultimately you need to assess that it's raining in your head. Um, but other than that, yeah, there's some kind of interesting episodes in here. I thought that there was some interesting things going on, but ultimately I didn't understand like the end goal of every episode, like what really like happened out of all this. Because ultimately there was like drawing of some conclusions where I'm just like, okay, so is everything copacetic? Is everything okay? Are we just gonna move on, or are these things gonna come back to haunt us? Let's just say, or are all these things not exactly 100% complete or done or whatever? Like, are these stories over to get us to the next bigger point of okay, what's going on now? um so I think other than that, I think that's all I wanted to say about these episodes. Really interesting, really fascinating. um I thought that there were some darker, like the first episode was very dark, but when looking at it, I was like wow, like it's kind of fascinating what they were doing in these episodes compared to everything else that I've seen so far, with the exclusion of probably the one episode or the early episodes where like Shadow Moon was making his way back uh, to his home. Uh, Ultimately realizing how extremely difficult that was ultimately going to be able to be. And that's what I thought was really interesting about the show. But these episodes were kind of interesting as well, to finally see the story of Thor being played out in this story. I thought was really fascinating. But anyways, I am going to get out of here. Thank you guys for otherwise being a part of this series of ultimately you've been watching every review. I appreciate you doing that. But on that, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.